What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and if you're enjoying the content here on my channel, then make sure you hit the like button and make sure you hit subscribe so you can help decide what direction the content on my channel goes in the foreseeable future. Okay, so continuing on with our discussion about Dark Knight's Metal, we pick up with part 3. And this is really cool because what this does is it gives us the origin of the Dark Multiverse. And it's really interesting. Plus it's also like Superman versus the Dark Knights. But remember, the whole idea of Dark Knight's Metal is it's kind of like this worst case scenario in a lot of ways. While we're not necessarily given a time frame of exactly when Dark Knight's Metal happens, that is to say, where it happens in relation to like the Justice League or something like that, for the most part it kind of focuses on the individual character's solo series in terms of placements about when different things happen, see Superman number such and such, see Action Comics, whatever. The whole idea is that where a lot of events that have been written in like Justice League so far, things like that, are really kind of dark and drabby, this takes it to a whole new level. Because in the last videos, we talked about how Batman was the key, that the idea here was that there were these metals that existed inside the DC universe. And originally they were just believed to have just been metals that were powerful for whatever reason, nth metal, promethium, dionysium, different things like that. But what this story revealed is that all those metals basically served as a kind of proving material, in the sense that when Batman was doused in all those metals, it basically allowed the evil Batman from the Dark Multiverse to enter the positive multiverse of DC, and for Batman to be sent to the Dark Multiverse. It basically opened a gateway. And so the whole idea here, the whole concept is, what's the next step? If the goal is to bring darkness into the positive multiverse, to basically initiate the plan of Barbados to bring everything crashing down, then there has to be an energy source for this. And the cool thing is that it was always believed to be Batman. That's everything we've seen so far. And so what this does is it initially picks up in Smallville, Kansas, which is cool because we've got Superboy, we've got Damian Wayne, and they're just kind of putting on a concert for like Lois and Wonder Woman and Batman and Superman, and it's cool because they're waiting on all the other superheroes to get there. Bruce goes on this whole diatribe about, hey guys, look, after this war we've won against Barbados, I'm so glad that we managed to pull this off. And it's interesting because this is the aftermath for Dark Knight's Metal. And so with this battle having been won against Barbados, with the Dark Knights having been defeated, life basically goes back to its own place. It goes back to regularity. And this is cool because this is one of the things you don't really see from Snyder. You don't really see this sort of peacetime situation. Instead, for the most part, you see the conflict situation. That is until Batman starts bleeding out of his chest in the form of a bat. And, and this starts freaking people out because in these moments when Bruce Wayne basically starts to die, he simply just says, Carpe diem, and then he's gone. In his place comes Barbados, and Barbados just kind of emerges, and Superman's kind of in shock and awe because in his mind, they won the conflict. It was all done. It was over. And Barbados simply says, that's because I let you believe that. Every road you take, it always leads to me. It always leads to darkness. And that's the cool thing because when the Dark Knights start showing up and they start, just eliminating like Lois Lane and Wonder Woman and all these different characters, Superman's just sort of forced to sit there and witness it. And so what ends up happening is he basically comes to. And what we end up finding out is that Superman and Wonder Woman, much like Batman, are forced to relive these recurring dreams. Keep in mind, when Batman was taken to the Dark Multiverse, when he was forced to switch places with the Dark Knights, what this meant was that within the Dark Multiverse, he was hooked up to a machine of sorts. And what this did is it basically forced him to just experience all these terrible universes that exist out there, all these terrible realities where everything that's bad has basically happened. With Superman and Lois Lane, it's much in the same vein. Remember, when Batman was first taken, Superman and Lois Lane were there, and they were basically captured and defeated by Barbados. It was a single touch is all it took to take them both down. That was the immense power that Barbados had. But more so than that, Superman comments to Wonder Woman that he's basically experienced this time and time again. He's tried to topple Barbados, and every single time he's failed. He's fought alongside the Joker and Lex Luthor. He's fought alongside Mr. Miracle and Orion. He's fought alongside all these different characters in the DC universe. And every time he goes against Barbados, he loses. And the reason for that is because he was hooked up to this machine. He was experiencing basically a series of dream states. But with him being yanked back to reality at this moment, the question becomes, what do we do? What's going on? What's been happening in the time that we've been gone? It's been 7 days. The world's basically gone to pieces. Over the course of these 7 days, we learned from the Devastator story, for example, that he basically spread the entire Doomsday virus to everybody in Metropolis and essentially just started turning them all into Doomsdays. They're just kind of walking around and they're sort of mindless beings. Superman learns that, Jonathan Kent's fine, Lois Lane has been transformed. These are the kind of things that go on. It's basically this idea that everything's going to pot. The issue is that once he's told that Barbados resides within Gotham City, he immediately heads there to try to take Barbados out. And this is interesting because this is not usually something that we see when it comes to the character of Superman. Superman's pretty hardcore when it comes to his family. Woe betide the poor soul who walks up and harms Jonathan Kent and Lois Lane, because they'll have to face the full unbridled wrath of Superman. But for the most part, he's still pretty intelligent. This moment right here where he just sort of flies off into the conflict is very indicative of like the new 52 Superman, young, headstrong, inexperienced, that Superman is emotional right now, feeling as though the world has been destroyed, or at least is being laid waste to, by all these different iterations of these evil Batman, these Dark Knights, all spearheaded by Barbados. And so as soon as he gets over to where Barbados is, where he gets relatively close, he immediately picks up on what he believes to be Bruce Wayne. And that is one of the coolest aspects of the Dark Knights, because remember, these are just different versions of Bruce Wayne from the Dark Multiverse. As far as Superman's concerned, they are Bruce Wayne, but the first person he encounters is Devastator Batman, who just wrecks Superman, immediately just like knocks him to the ground in one hit. After that, it's the Batman Who Laughs. Now keep in mind, Devastator Batman is basically Doomsday Batman. What would happen if Batman was infected with the Doomsday virus? The Batman Who Laughs is a lot more methodical. He's not really a fighter so much as he's a manipulator, a planner, and a schemer. And so in that regard, instead of just showing up and just beating up, Superman, so on and so forth, he for the most part lets Devastator Batman do all the heavy lifting. For the character of the Batman Who Laughs, it's a psychological war. It's mind games. It's messing with Superman. But one of the big things he does is he actually spills the beans on the nature of the Dark Multiverse. And this is something that we didn't know before. All we knew was that the Dark Multiverse was just there, that it was basically like two sides of the same coin. What the Batman Who Laughs says is that the Dark Multiverse has existed so long as there have been sentient beings. When the first being had their first nightmare, the Dark Multiverse began to take shape. The Dark Multiverse is nothing more than just the worst fears of different beings that have all just come to life. That's why there's an infinite number of worlds in the Dark Multiverse, because there's an infinite number of fears and nightmares that people could possibly experience. The Dark Knights represent only one facet. They represent the fears of Batman. They represent the idea of Batman being terrified of becoming Doomsday. They represent the idea of Batman being terrified of merging with the Flash and becoming a villain. These are all the things that Batman is terrified of, all the fears or all the nightmares he's ever had. But one of the things that the Batman Who Laughs says is, in every single universe that we're in every single reality that happens, Batman, sometimes maybe he kills the Justice League, sometimes he doesn't, but he always kills you. And so the idea that the Batman Who Laughs raises is maybe it's just a desire of Batman to destroy you, to take you out. But because it's predicated and rooted in fear, means that it comes to fruition in the Dark Multiverse. And that's cool, because it basically brings to realization this idea: if the Dark Knights represent one facet of the Dark Multiverse and they're only confined to some of the worst fears of Batman, what are the worst fears of Superman? What are the worst fears of Wonder Woman, of the Green Lantern, Hal Jordan? This is basically Scott Snyder drawing giant purple letters in a comic book saying, this is only the beginning. You'll start to see all these crazy stories coming out of existence in the Dark Multiverse because there's so much to be explored. It may be that there's somebody out there worse than Barbados, but in the midst of this battle, the Flash, Barry Allen, races in, grabs Superman, and takes off. And the reason why is because they basically bring him to a place called the Oblivion Bar. Now, a little bit of history here. With Marvel becoming such a huge competitor to DC in the 1960s, with like Thor and the Return of Captain America, Spider-Man, the X-Men, Fantastic Four, there was basically like this great gold rush of superheroes that was coming out of the comic book industry. It's one of the reasons why people say the 1970s running up to the 1990s, for that 20-year span, was one of the most prolific eras in comic books because publishers were just cranking out superheroes and comics all over the place. But back in 1969, with, it was DC Showcase number 82, a guy by the name of Jim Rook was created. The general idea is that he was one of the characters that sort of fell in line with the Constantine Swamp Thing-esque line of stories, in the sense they didn't really cross over with a lot of major superheroes. Instead, he was part of that darker, mystic, magic, basically the predecessor to what would become Vertigo later on down the line. In his journeys, he had stumbled across a place called the Oblivion Bar. And the Oblivion Bar was just kind of this place where different people would go to when they were part of the whole, like Constantine, different things like that. They would show up to that whole location. But it's basically one of the last safe places in existence. The problem with this is that in rescuing Superman, while all these members who had fought the Dark Knights and the origin stories of the Dark Knights, when all those characters were being whisked away by Dr. Fate at the end of the stories, this is where they were coming to. But because of the fact that they basically grabbed Superman and brought him here in the midst of his battle with the Dark Knights, while it was being observed by Barbados, what they've effectively done is left a magic-based breadcrumb trail. And so it's only a matter of time before they find out where they're at. And they've got minutes before the Dark Knights get there, and all things begin to go into pandemonium. And so what ends up happening is we get this sort of quick rundown of the things that have been going on, in the sense that, the murder machine basically sent all these different versions of Alfred to Detroit, these, machine-based Alfreds. Of course, we read about that in the origin story. We read about how Red Death had basically initiated a speed force storm that kills everybody who comes into contact with it. That in all these origin stories, when these Dark Knights were popping up in the respective cities where they showed up, they've basically been conquered. What we also end up finding out, though, is that from Green Arrow, Nth Metal harms these various members of the Dark Knights. It's their equivalent of kryptonite, and the only way to really defeat them is to use Nth Metal. But as we've covered, Nth Metal is just one of those very rare materials that exists out there, and there's almost none of it left. And so what they need is not just Nth Metal, but basically any of the metals that were used to bond to Batman to send him to the Dark Multiverse. So it basically turns into this idea where it's the hunt for Nth Metal alongside these other metals that are out there. The problem is that while this is going on, you also have Dr. Fate, you have, Mr. Terrific, Plastic Man, who's still in an egg. You have a lot of these superheroes who really haven't been seen in the New 52 that DC's only now bringing back in DC Rebirth, analyzing all these things out there and saying, okay, here's locations we can go to find these different aspects of these different metals. But one thing I want you to notice is that the location of one of these metals is in the center of the multiverse, also known as the Rock of Eternity. Now, those of you guys who know about the Rock of Eternity, I'm sure you're just like, yes! The Rock of Eternity, like one of the things being at the Rock of Eternity is a big deal because the person who resides at the Rock of Eternity is Shazam. And we have no idea where Shazam is. We know he was in like the Constantine book, but that was it. We've seen neither hide nor hair of him since DC Rebirth showed up. And so this seems to indicate the idea that even if it's only a cameo, we may have Shazam in the Dark Knight's metal book. What this does is it invokes the idea that the metals that they're hunting for are not just Earth-based. Despite the story largely focusing on Nth Metal and its involvement on the planet Earth, Nth Metal stretches across the cosmos, and there's a huge chunk of Nth Metal that resides within the Dark Multiverse. Now, the indication seems to be here that Carter Hall, basically Hawkman, the being that set all this stuff in motion in the first place, most likely he's being held in the Dark Multiverse, and the Nth Metal is with him. We're not 100% sure, but the other speculation offered by the superheroes is that Batman has that Nth Metal on him, and so Batman has it as a means, once he's able to escape the control of Barbados, to use it against the Dark Knights. This is when Superman begins to step up. Superman's rationale is Batman needs to be saved, and Batman's asking to be saved. The reason why he says this is because in that dream Superman was having, when Batman said Carpe Diem, there was a reason behind it. Within DC Comics, while it is currently a title at the moment, and it has been in the past, you basically have what's called the Trinity: Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman, the three most popular characters in DC Comics for the most part. The idea is that with the three of them being the Trinity, there was basically a sort of code that was set up between the three of them in order to ensure that if any of them was in danger, they could call for aid. In the case of Batman, it was Clark Diana, CD. In the case of Wonder Woman, it was Batman and Clark, it was BC. That was the pattern that they used. When Batman made the statement Carpe Diem, it wasn't saying Carpe Diem, it was saying CD. Clark Diana, come and help me. It was Batman calling for aid. Superman basically says, Batman's calling for our help. Batman's being held there. We have to get to the Dark Multiverse. We have to save him. If we do, then everything will be fine. But in the middle of all that, of course, one of the little Robins of the Batman Who Laughs shows up, and he's immediately taken out by a dagger of sorts, only for us to find out the person who threw it is Deathstroke. And that's cool, because it's basically Deathstroke being rolled in to this whole thing. Now, I firmly believe this is being done just because of the Justice League movie, but, Deathstroke, in terms of his role in the greater pantheon of things, it actually makes sense, because Deathstroke has for years used armor and weapons made out of promethium. It's a hallmark of his character. Promethium is one of the metals that was bonded to Batman to send him to the Dark Multiverse. And so much like a tuning fork of sorts, or two magnets, that are basically pulled together, promethium can offer itself as sort of a tracking device to figure out these different metals that exist out there. And so what they end up doing is splitting into groups, going to Atlantis, going to middle of space, the Rock of Eternity. But before they do, Superman grabs the Flash and they race off to the Fortress of Solitude, because one of the things that Flash makes a comment on, and really even one of the things that Steel makes a comment on, is the Tower of the Anti-Monitor. This whole tower basically made its appearance in the events of Infinite Crisis. Now, when the New 52 first started in 2011, Infinite Crisis was wiped away, had technically never happened. What this does is it says, actually it did, that the heroes remember Infinite Crisis. They remember all those events taking place. And so it's kind of cool. More so than that, Superman has this really interesting plan with regards to how to get to the Dark Multiverse. If we use the Grand Canyon as an example, on one side is Superman, on the other side is the Dark Multiverse. In the middle of the Grand Canyon is the Phantom Zone, basically this massive prison that people are sent into whenever it is they're imprisoned by Kryptonians historically. metaphorically. The question is, how do we create a bridge that gets us through the Phantom Zone and to the other side where the Dark Multiverse is? Now, in my mind, because of the fact that the Dark Multiverse is on the opposite side of the positive multiverse, I would say it's not just the Phantom Zone in that huge canyon, so to speak. That you've basically got the edge of the multiverse, maybe even the edge of the source wall. I have no earthly clue what's there, but I would say it's probably more than just the Phantom Zone. But even if it is, what it basically means is the Phantom Zone is not just this endless void that's out there. Instead, the Phantom Zone is a finite space. It's basically a giant room, more or less, where people are housed. It's not an endless expanse of a dimension or anything along those lines. So it's kind of cool. Superman's argument is, if we're able to use the Speed Force in conjunction with this giant tower that basically emits these different frequencies that'll allow us to vibrate through the multiverse, then what you can do is supercharge using your Speed Force and allow me to punch through. And that's cool because that's exactly what happens. Superman basically races through, Steel using his energy signatures to basically just start amping up the tower of the Anti-Monitor, Flash using the Speed Force to supercharge Superman and sending him through there, basically meaning that for a moment in time, Superman gets the powers of the Flash, but Superman basically punching through and getting to the Dark Multiverse, what we end up finding out is exactly what we expected. This was a trap. It was never designed to actually allow Superman to rescue Batman. Instead of running into all these Dark Knights, what he runs into are all these evil versions of himself, these evil versions of Superman that exist out there. What ends up happening is Batman says, "I warned you not to come here." When the song was played at the beginning of the story with our sons playing that rock band, you heard CD. The actual song was DC. Don't come here. And so it was awesome because it's basically Batman who sent a code to Superman saying, look, do not come to this place. Do not come here. It's a trap. The reason why is because Superman is a living solar battery. He's the source of energy that they need to allow the Dark Knights to sort of open up this dark energy portal and literally engulf the multiverse in darkness. In essence, in Superman's rush to save the life of Batman, he's doomed the multiverse in DC Comics. With that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this video to an end. If you are new here, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoy this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.